Power has a way of lying to itself. It tells men that scale equals control. That distance can be erased by reputation alone, that a name, repeated often enough, becomes law everywhere it lands. Al Capone lived inside that lie for a long time, not because he was foolish, but because the world kept proving him right. Chicago bent, politicians folded, rivals vanished. When that happens often enough, a man stops asking where his power ends. He begins to assume it doesn't. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was believing Harlem was a place that needed to be conquered rather than understood. From Chicago's vantage point, Harlem was numbers on a page: population density, cash flow, distribution routes, nightclubs that laundered money behind velvet curtains. It looked loud, chaotic, fragmented, the kind of place that collapses under pressure because it never unified in the first place. That reading could not have been more wrong. Harlem was not fragmented, it was layered. And layers confuse outsiders. Capone's advisors framed the move as inevitable. Harlem was growing, its influence was spreading, the money was too visible to ignore. Allowing it to remain independent sent the wrong signal. Reputation demanded correction. So correction was ordered, not as war, as enforcement. 17 men were chosen not because they were reckless, but because they were efficient. They had handled delicate problems before. They knew how to enter unfamiliar cities quietly and leave them broken without attracting the kind of attention that complicates business. They were told this would be quick, that Harlem had leaders, but no generals. That resistance would scatter once pressure arrived. That fear would arrive first, and compliance would follow. None of those assumptions survived contact with the street. Harlem did not panic when word traveled, and word always travels. It moved through barbershops where men lingered longer than necessary, through numbers, houses where runners stopped mid-count, through churches where women prayed for calm without being told why, through doormen who watched unfamiliar shoes step onto familiar sidewalks. The warning did not come as an alarm. It came as a pause. Schedules adjusted, meetings postponed, deliveries delayed without explanation. No orders were shouted. No central command issued instructions. Harlem did not function that way. What outsiders called disorganization was, in reality, decentralization perfected. And at the center of that system sat a man who did not need to announce himself. Bumpy Johnson did not learn power from books or boardrooms. He learned it from proximity, from watching how men move when they believe they are unseen and how neighborhoods respond when they feel threatened. He understood something Capone did not. Territory is not owned by force. It is maintained by awareness. Bumpy knew who was coming before they boarded the train, not because he had spies in Chicago, but because Chicago always leaked. Too many mouths, too many egos, too much confidence in systems that assumed invisibility. By the time the men arrived, Harlem had already decided how the night would end, not in chaos, in silence. That decision mattered, because silence denies spectacle. And spectacle is what invaders rely on. They need reaction, they need panic, they need noise to mask mistakes. Harlem offered none of it. So when the 17 men finally stepped into the city, coats heavy, weapons hidden, confidence intact, they mistook calm for ignorance. They mistook normalcy for blindness. They mistook absence for opportunity. They did not realize that the absence was intentional, that the streets were being cleared not out of fear but out of precision, that the city was narrowing its focus, that they were being guided into spaces chosen long before they arrived. This was not a standoff waiting to happen. It was a conclusion catching up to them, and the most dangerous part of that night was not the guns. It was the moment they realized no one was coming to stop what was about to happen, because everyone who mattered already knew it would. Power behaves differently depending on the ground it stands on. In Chicago, power was vertical. It flowed downward through politicians, police captains, ward bosses, and precinct sergeants. It was centralized, bureaucratic, transactional. You could buy it, threaten it, or replace it. Al Capone understood that system intuitively. He didn't need affection. He needed compliance. Chicago complied. Harlem never worked that way. By the early 1930s, Harlem had become something unprecedented in American history, a dense, self-contained black city inside a larger metropolis that neither protected nor understood it. Segregation forced proximity. Proximity bred familiarity. Familiarity created informal systems of enforcement and intelligence that no outside organization could easily penetrate. Information traveled faster than money. People noticed who didn't belong. Accents mattered. Shoes mattered. Who spoke to whom mattered. A man asking the wrong question on the wrong corner could set off a chain reaction before he reached the end of the block. This was the environment Bumpy Johnson came up in. He did not inherit Harlem. He studied it, learned its rhythms, learned who mattered and why, learned that violence without purpose only invited retaliation, but restraint backed by credibility created loyalty. He learned from Stephanie St. Clair, a woman who understood contracts, courts, and corruption better than most men carrying guns. She taught him that survival wasn't about being feared. It was about being indispensable. So when Prohibition turned alcohol into the most profitable illegal commodity in the country, Harlem didn't need Chicago. It already had distribution, protection, and demand. What it didn't need was outside control, siphoning money out while importing chaos in. Capone's liquor arrived without context, without consent, without respect. The prices were higher than local operators charged. The quality was worse. The dealers answered to Chicago, not the block. Violence followed because intimidation was their only language. That violence disrupted the ecosystem. Bumpy noticed the imbalance immediately, not as an insult, but as a threat to stability. Harlem didn't reject money, it rejected extraction. His response wasn't loud, it was surgical. Routes broke down, drivers vanished, dealers found themselves arrested not because Harlem cooperated with police, but because Harlem knew when police were already coming. Speakeasies lost supply. Policy banks shifted alliances. Chicago interpreted this as resistance. Harlem understood it as correction. When Capone sent representatives, the conversation was already obsolete. Bumpy had already decided the outcome. He wasn't interested in coexistence because coexistence implied submission to Chicago's rules. Harlem operated on its own. That refusal hardened into principle. And principles, once drawn, force escalation. Capone believed escalation meant force. Bumpy believed escalation meant preparation. While Chicago assembled men, Harlem assembled silence. While Capone counted guns, Bumpy counted windows, rooftops, stairwells, sightlines, neighbors, and time. By the time the telegrams were exchanged, the war had already been decided, not by violence, but by who understood where they were standing. By the time the men from Chicago arrived in New York, the city had already registered them, not officially, not in paperwork, but in the way neighborhoods do when unfamiliar weight presses against familiar ground. 17 men stepped off the train carrying themselves like professionals. Their coats were right, their hats were right, their silence was rehearsed. To an outsider, they looked like businessmen moving through the city with purpose. To Harlem, they looked like men who did not belong. Harlem did not respond with panic. Panic is loud. Panic exposes itself. Panic draws attention, and attention invites mistakes. Harlem responded the way organisms respond to threat, by redistributing resources and minimizing exposure. Money moved first. Policy banks closed early without explanation. Cash was lifted, books removed, ledgers burned or hidden. Runners were told to stay home. Speakeasies dimmed their lights, then brought them back up after patrons were quietly ushered out. Music was left playing in empty rooms because sound creates expectation, and expectation breeds false confidence. People moved next. Families disappeared from apartments without luggage, no shouting, no rushed exits. Children were taken to relatives across boroughs. Wives went to stay with cousins. Mothers left food cooling on stoves that would not be touched until morning. What remained looked occupied. That was the point. Chicago's men planned for resistance. They planned for gunfire. They planned for chaos. They did not plan for absence masquerading as normalcy. They did not understand that Harlem had already decided not to fight on their terms. The crews divided as professionals always do, multiple targets, synchronized timing, overwhelming force. They believed they were executing a coordinated strike. In reality, they were walking into a coordinated vacuum. The first team moved toward a club known for business meetings and quiet authority. They waited, watched, saw light, heard music, observed shadows moving behind windows. All the indicators of occupancy were there. What they didn't see were the angles. Harlem had no interest in firefights inside buildings. Interiors trap sound, exteriors create exposure. So the engagement points were chosen deliberately. Doorways, sidewalks, thresholds where men transition from cover to vulnerability. When the first shots rang out, they did not echo long. Fire came from above, across, and behind, not wildly, not continuously. Short bursts, controlled timing, enough to neutralize movement without inviting return fire. Men trained for direct confrontation found themselves pinned without targets to shoot at. Automatic weapons became useless weight. The street offered no cover. The doorway became a funnel. The engagement ended almost as soon as it began. There were no celebrations, no confirmations shouted. The men who fired withdrew immediately, disappearing into buildings that already knew them. Silence returned. Elsewhere, another team advanced on what they believed were financial nerve centers, policy banks, counting rooms, places where money pooled and records lived. They came prepared to destroy evidence and people together. They carried fire as a solution. They found buildings that accepted fire easily. Windows broke, flames caught, rooms burned, no one ran. That absence told the story faster than gunfire ever could. By the time they realized the structures were empty, they were already exposed. Rooftops overlooked the street. Upper floor windows framed the sidewalks like corridors. Rifles replaced automatic weapons. Precision replaced volume. Men scattered, but the street was wide and the angles were wrong. One fell, then another. Not dramatically, not loudly, just suddenly, no longer moving. The survivors tried to flee into spaces they did not understand, alleys that did not lead where they expected, shadows that did not hide them. The neighborhood did not pursue them. It let them run into endings already placed. By the time the fires burned themselves down, the second team no longer existed. Still, Harlem did not relax. The night was not over. The final group moved more carefully. Experience told them something had gone wrong. Distant sounds carried meaning. Gunfire, heard but not answered. Silence where activity should have been. Patterns breaking down, but orders remained orders. They moved toward a residential building, a place meant to hold family, routine, normal life. They expected chaos. They found vacancy. Furniture remained. Personal items untouched, beds made, doors unlocked. The absence here felt deliberate. This was not evacuation. It was invitation. The realization settled slowly. That is often how professionals fail, not through ignorance, but through delayed recognition. By the time understanding arrives, options are already limited. This is where legend enters the record, not because history confirms every detail, but because Harlem remembers what mattered. The meeting that followed was quiet. No raised voices, no sudden movements. The surviving Chicago men faced something they had not prepared for, a man who did not need to demonstrate power because the night already had. Bumpy Johnson did not posture. He did not threaten. He did not celebrate. He explained. He explained that the neighborhood had been watching for months, that strangers do not arrive unnoticed, that trains have porters, streets have eyes, buildings have memory, that Harlem does not require walls because it already functions as one. He explained that violence was never the goal. Stability was, and stability had just been defended. Most importantly, he explained why one man would be allowed to leave, not as mercy, as strategy. By the time dawn approached, Harlem was quiet again. Streets cleaned, fires extinguished, bodies removed or covered, life preparing to resume. 16 men were dead, not because they were weak, but because they fought a place they did not understand. One man remained alive because the story needed an ending that traveled. The man who left Harlem before sunrise did not run. He walked, not because he felt safe, but because panic would have confirmed what he already knew, that the night had ended with an answer he could not change. He had arrived as part of an overwhelming force. He departed as evidence. The streets did not follow him. No footsteps echoed behind him. No gunfire chased the cars as they pulled away. Harlem had no need to dramatize the exit. The message had already been written into the pavement, into the silence, into the empty spaces where men had stood only hours earlier. When Frank Needy returned to Chicago, He did not embellish. Men like Nitti understand the danger of exaggeration. He delivered facts stripped of pride and emotion, numbers, outcomes, patterns. 17 went east, 16 did not return. Al Capone listened. This mattered. Capone was not reckless. He did not build an empire by confusing rage with strategy. He had survived betrayals, wars, and internal revolts because he understood when force produced returns and when it produced only losses. What he heard unsettled him, not because men had died, men were always dying, but because they had died without chaos. There was no prolonged war, no tit-for-tat escalation, no headlines screaming retaliation, just a clean absence where Capone's reach was supposed to be absolute. Harlem had not declared independence with speeches or banners. It had done something far more dangerous. It had demonstrated control. Capone asked questions about timing, about how the targets had been empty, about how the attackers had been seen before they struck, about why only one man had lived. The answers all pointed to the same conclusion. This was not a fluke. This was not luck. This was preparation embedded so deeply into a neighborhood that outside force could not penetrate it without bleeding. Capone did the math. Every expansion carries cost. Violence is an investment, not an impulse. Chicago paid because Chicago could absorb it. Harlem would not. To win Harlem would require more men, more attention, more exposure. It would require holding ground in a place where every resident functioned as early warning. It would require a level of occupation that defeated the purpose of expansion in the first place. The cost outweighed the profit. So Capone did what empires do when confronted with limits they cannot publicly acknowledge. He withdrew quietly. On paper, it was a business decision. Markets reassessed, supply chains redirected. Officially, Harlem simply did not justify continued investment. Unofficially, everyone who mattered understood the truth. Capone had met resistance that could not be broken without destroying more than it was worth. Word traveled, not through newspapers, through corridors of power where names carried weight and silence carried warning. Other organizations paid attention: Luciano, Costello, Lansky. Men who understood the territory mattered more than bravado. Harlem was marked, not as weak, as untouchable. Bumpy Johnson did not celebrate. There were no parades, no speeches, no claims of victory. Men who live long in that world do not announce success. They absorb it quietly and return to maintenance. But the cost was real. Bodies do not disappear just because a story ends. Families lost sons, brothers, fathers. Harlem absorbed the loss the way it absorbed everything else, collectively. Quiet help. Envelopes passed, debts forgiven, children looked after. This part never makes the legend. It shouldn't be forgotten. Bumpy carried it. That night did not make him fearless. It made him heavier. Responsibility settles differently when you understand that your decisions ripple outward. He did not mistake survival for triumph. He understood that every defensive victory still leaves scars. Years passed. Capone fell the way many empires do, not to rivals but to bureaucracy. Numbers caught up with him where guns could not. Chicago moved on. Leadership changed. Strategies evolved. One rule remained: stay out of Harlem. Frank Nitti remembered the night differently than the others who heard the story secondhand. He remembered it not as humiliation, but as instruction. When he later held power, his leadership reflected the lesson Harlem taught him, that violence without understanding only accelerates collapse. Bumpy Johnson lived decades longer, not untouched by prison, not untouched by conflict, but untouched by conquest. Harlem remained his ground not because he dominated it, but because he aligned with it. That distinction mattered. History often frames criminal power as a hierarchy of brutality. The bigger the gun, the louder the name, the stronger the man. Harlem offered a counterexample. It showed that power rooted in community behaves differently. It does not need constant demonstration. It does not travel well. It does not scale cleanly. But within its borders, it is immovable. That is why this story survives, not because it flatters violence, but because it exposes misunderstanding. Al Capone represented empire, expansion, reputation, reach. Bumpy Johnson represented place, knowledge, patience, embedded authority. When those two models collided, the empire failed to adapt. The lesson was not that Capone was weak, it was that he was out of position. And in conflicts between position and ambition, position usually wins. Harlem did not conquer Chicago. It did not need to. It simply refused to be taken. That refusal reshaped how power moved across American organized crime. It taught outsiders that some neighborhoods are not open markets. Some communities do not respond to intimidation. Some leaders cannot be removed without consequences that ripple outward indefinitely. 17 men went east believing fear would arrive before resistance. 16 learned otherwise. 1 survived to carry the truth back. That truth ended a war before it could properly begin. And that is why the night remains, not as a story of gunfire, but as a case study in restraint. Not as a myth of violence, but as a demonstration of intelligence. Not as a tale of conquest, but as proof that home, when defended collectively, outweighs any empire built elsewhere. That is what Harlem taught Chicago. And that is why no one ever tried again.